The old wolf approached the foal and did something incredible. What would compel an old predator, standing on the brink of starvation, to break the most fundamental law of nature? This question had not yet formed in Andrei Sokolov's mind. For now, he was merely a silent witness. The click of his camera shutter sounded dry and lonely in the scorching air. Through the long focus lens, the world shrunk to 2 points. The first point was a mighty black stallion on top of a hill, the living embodiment of strength and power. The second was a barely visible gray shadow at the edge of the forest, a shadow that had been following the herd for 3 days in a row. Andrei knew it was a wolf, an old one, judging by its slow, almost pained gait. And lonely. And a lonely wolf in summer is a hungry wolf. The photographer lowered his camera. In the haze of the scorching air, the valley looked like a stage on which an ancient drama was about to begin. And he had a front row seat. Before we continue, let us know which city you are from. We are interested to know where our videos are being watched. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your rating. This motivates us to make new and interesting videos. Well, let's begin. Andrei adjusted the camouflage net on his hideout. 45 years, 20 of which he spent like this, in ambush, waiting for that one shot. He came here to the foothills of the Altai Mountains in search of a story about wild mustangs, descendants of feral horses. He was looking for images of strength, freedom, and untouched nature. And he found them. The herd led by Grom was perfect. The leader was a real tyrant who never took his eyes off his mares. His harem was flawless. But within this perfect world, a crack was already forming. Andrei saw it every day. A young stallion, Burin, handsome and insolent, was increasingly testing the leader's authority. He would get too close to the young mares and snort defiantly when Grom looked in his direction. It was a powder keg, and the fuse was already smoldering. But there was another story, one that unfolded in the shadows. The story of Sedoy. That was the name Andrei had given the wolf because of the almost white fur on its muzzle. It was a ghost. It appeared at dawn on the distant ridge, disappeared at noon, and in the evening its silhouette reappeared against the backdrop of the sunset. He didn't howl, he just watched. And that anticipation was scarier than any roar. Andrei knew who the wolf was looking at. His camera often caught this little one too, a foal named Wind. Born that spring, he was the embodiment of carefree. His long, clumsy legs were constantly tangled, and his curiosity outweighed any fear. His mother, a red mare named Zarya, seemed to be made of pure anxiety. She never left him for a second, constantly saying something to him in her horse language, nudging him with her muzzle closer to the center of the herd. She sensed danger. You can't fool a mother's heart. Today, the tension was almost palpable. Burin had crossed the line again. He tried to lead one of the mares to the stream, pointedly ignoring Grom's threatening snorts. The leader would not tolerate it. A short, furious roar, and there they stood, facing each other, flaring their nostrils. The ground shook from the impact of hooves. The herd froze, huddling together. The mares shifted uneasily from foot to foot. At that moment, Andrei pointed his camera back at the edge of the forest. The gray-haired man was there. He wasn't lying down as usual. He was standing, leaning slightly on his injured leg and watching. Not at the stallions. His gaze was fixed on a small, light spot in the center of the agitated herd. On Wind. The wolf understood what the horses had not yet realized. When the leaders fight, the herd's defense weakens. Grom let out a battle cry, and the fight began. It was not a dance, but a brutal brawl. Teeth clenched, hooves struck bodies with a dull thud. Burin was younger and faster. But Grom was unmatched in fury and experience. Andre feverishly filmed, changing angles. But out of the corner of his eye, he kept watching the forest. And not for nothing. The gray-haired man began to move. Not quickly, but slowly, almost stealthily. He glided along the trees, using the terrain to get closer. His plan was simple and brilliant in its cruelty. While the alpha males were figuring out who was boss, he would take the easiest prey. Zarya understood this too. She desperately tried to lead her foal away from the fight, into the center of the herd. But Wind, as if spellbound, watched the duel. Suddenly, everything changed. Wind's curiosity overcame his fear. He saw a butterfly, a bright yellow swallowtail, fluttering among the wild raspberry bushes. For a second, forgetting everything else in the world, he made a few playful leaps toward it. Only 10 meters from the herd, 15, 20. Zarya let out a piercing neigh, but her cry was drowned out by the roar of the fighting stallions. Andre froze. He shifted his lens from the stallions to the bushes. Between the leaves, he saw them. 2 yellow, hungry eyes. The gray-haired man froze, turning into a statue. He waited. One more step from the foal, and it would jump. Andre held his breath. A thought flashed through his mind. I mustn't interfere. It's the law of nature. But his fingers tightened around the camera body of their own accord. Zarya rushed after her son. She ran without looking where she was going, her eyes filled with terror. Grom, momentarily distracted from the fight, saw this. He understood everything in a second. With a furious roar that made Burin recoil, he turned and rushed forward. Not toward the foal, but toward the forest. He rushed straight to the place where the wolf was hiding. It was a crazy, suicidal maneuver. But it worked. Seeing a ton of rage rushing toward him, the gray wolf retreated. He couldn't risk an open battle with the leader. He slipped back into the shadows of the trees and disappeared. Grom slammed on the brakes at the edge of the forest, furiously pawing the ground with his hooves. He had won the battle without even fighting it. Zarya picked up Wind and led him to safety. The tension eased, but Andre knew that this was only a rehearsal. The main act of this drama was yet to come. 2 days passed. 2 days of heavy, oppressive calm. The herd was nervous. The defeat had not broken Burin, but only made him angrier. He kept to himself, and several young mares and stallions stayed close to him, forming a faction, a split within the family. Thunder was on alert around the clock. He hardly slept, constantly patrolling his territory, his ears twitching nervously, picking up every rustle. He knew the wolf hadn't gone away. It was waiting. Andre was waiting too. He changed the memory card in his camera and checked the battery charge. The air became thick and humid. On the horizon, beyond the stone ridge, heavy purple clouds were gathering. A storm was approaching. Gray also sensed the change in the weather. The pain in the old wound on his paw intensified. His hunger was almost unbearable. He hadn't eaten for 4 days. The water from the stream only temporarily dulled the spasms in his stomach. He lay under the roots of an uprooted pine tree, his yellow eyes seeming to dim. He could see what was happening in the herd. He saw the division, he saw the fatigue of the leader. And he waited for the perfect storm, literally and figuratively. He knew that a storm meant chaos, and chaos was a hunter's best friend. His strategy changed. Now he wasn't just waiting for a mistake. He was waiting for nature itself to create an opportunity for him. And nature did not keep him waiting. By evening, the sky had turned black. The first clap of thunder sounded so close that the earth shook. The horses panicked and huddled together. The wind cowered fearfully against its mother's side. And at that moment, Burin decided that his time had come. Taking advantage of the general confusion, He attacked Grom again. But this time, it was not a duel. It was a cowardly attack from behind. Grom, distracted by a flash of lightning, was not ready. The blow of the hooves hit him in the side. The leader staggered. The battle began. But now it was not just a fight for power. It was a fight for survival in the midst of a raging storm. The rain poured down in sheets. Visibility dropped to a few meters. The herd was in a frenzy, driven mad by fear, thunder, and the clattering of their leader's teeth. Andre could barely wipe the lens. Water flooded the shelter. He filmed almost blindly, guided by flashes of lightning. He saw shadows darting about and heard neighing full of pain and fear. And he lost sight of the foal. Zarya tried to hold him back. But in the chaos, with crazed adult horses pushing from all sides, she couldn't. Another deafening clap of thunder struck right above his head. The wind, completely losing its mind with terror, veered away from its mother. It ran. He just ran, seeing nothing in front of him, fleeing from the sound and light that seemed to want to tear him apart. Andre pointed his camera after him, but the small figure immediately dissolved into the wall of rain. And then the photographer heard a new sound, a plaintive, desperate neigh that cut off abruptly. The wind died down. Andre realized that something terrible had happened. He dropped the camera, grabbed a powerful flashlight and a raincoat. The principle of non-interference had just been burned to a crisp in a blinding flash of lightning. The downpour had turned the ground into a sticky, squelching swamp. Andre ran, stumbling over roots invisible in the darkness. The powerful beam of the flashlight picked out tree trunks distorted beyond recognition, streams of water rushing down the slopes, and a wall of rain that seemed to never end. He shouted the name he had given the foal, "Wind! Wind!" But his voice was drowned out before it had traveled 10 meters. He cursed himself for his inaction, for his stupid professional ethics as an observer. What the hell were the laws of nature when a defenseless creature was dying before his eyes? He had long since ceased to be just a photographer. He had lived with this herd for almost a month. He knew their habits, could distinguish their voices. He had witnessed Wind's birth. And now he, a 45-year-old man, was running through the storm to try to fix something he had no right to interfere with. Meanwhile, the one who had every right to do so had already found his target. The gray-haired man moved through the storm like a ghost. The sound of the rain and thunder was his perfect cover. His paws made no sound on the wet ground. The pain in his wounded leg was hellish, but his hunger was stronger. He wasn't running. He was conserving his last ounce of strength. His sense of smell, sharpened to the limit, guided him unerringly. He caught the faint, panicked scent of a foal and another, the smell of fresh clay and fear. Gray came to the edge of a small but deep ravine. Its slopes, washed away by water, had turned into a slippery, almost vertical wall. And at the bottom, in a pool of dirty water, lay Wind. He tried to stand up, but his hind leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. With every movement, he let out a quiet, plaintive moan. He was trapped. Perfect prey. A gift from fate, for which the wolf had paid with weeks of hunger and suffering. At the other end of the valley, the drama reached its climax. Thunder was wounded. A deep bite on his shoulder was bleeding, mixing with the rainwater. But his fury was unbreakable. He gathered all his strength for one last, decisive blow. He brought down his entire weight on Burin, knocking him to the ground. He did not finish him off. He simply stood over his defeated rival, and his menacing roar, drowning out even the rumble of thunder, was more eloquent than any bite. He said, "I am the leader here, and it will always be so." Burin, defeated and humiliated, got up and limped away. At that moment, another sound reached Grom. It was not the roar of the storm, nor the groans of his enemy. It was the desperate neighing of Zarya. She was rushing around the clearing, sniffing the ground, and her cry was so full of horror that even the wounded leader forgot his victory. He understood. The foal was gone. Andre almost fell into the same ravine. He managed to grab hold of a slippery root at the last moment. The beam of his flashlight slid down the clay slope and caught a scene in the darkness that made his heart stop. At the bottom of the ravine, just a couple of meters from the trembling foal, stood Gray. The wolf! The predator had found its prey. Andre froze, not breathing. He knew he was too late. What had to happen was about to happen. A cruel but honest ending. He saw the wolf slowly, as if savoring the moment, approach Vetter. The foal fell silent, frozen with terror. It just stared at its death with huge, rain-filled eyes. Andre gripped the lantern tighter, his knuckles turning white. There was nothing he could do. Any movement, any cry would only hasten the end. The gray-haired wolf came close. He bowed his head, and Andre was sure that he would now see a deadly bite to the neck. But the wolf did not do it. He sniffed the foal's helplessly twisted leg for a long time, almost curiously. There was no aggression in his movements. There was some kind of ancient, thoughtful concentration. Andre couldn't understand what was happening. It violated all the laws he had studied for years. A predator doesn't play with its food when it's starving. Then the wolf raised its head and looked up at the slippery slope from which the foal had fallen. It seemed to be measuring something, assessing it, and then something happened that Andre would never have believed if he hadn't seen it with his own eyes. The old, emaciated wolf turned and pressed its shoulder against the foal's side. It didn't bite. It pushed. The wind fluttered fearfully, but the push was persistent and confident. The gray wolf growled quietly, and there was no threat in the sound, more like coercion. "Get up," he seemed to say. The foal, instinctively obeying the force, tried to lean on its healthy legs. The gray-haired man pushed again, guiding it toward a gentler part of the slope. He used his head and his body to help the foal find purchase on the slippery clay. It was incredible. It was impossible. A hungry predator was saving its potential killer. Step by step, push by push, he pushed wind out of the deadly trap. Andre stood thunderstruck, his lantern shaking, the beam of light dancing across this unimaginable scene. He forgot how to breathe. His whole world, all his knowledge of the wild, was crumbling at that very moment. Finally, with one last desperate effort, wind made it to level ground. He immediately jumped aside, limping and trembling all over. Gray-haired and breathing heavily, he followed. He stood there, steam rising from his wet coat. He didn't look at the foal. He looked at the forest as if his mission had been accomplished. And at that very moment, attracted by the plaintive neighing of their son, dawn and thunder appeared at the edge of the ravine. The picture they saw was unambiguous. Their wounded child and the predator standing next to him. Instinct took over. Zarya let out a fierce battle cry and rushed forward, ready to trample the wolf. But Thunder, despite his wound, was faster. He blocked her path, standing between her and the wolf. He, an experienced leader, saw what the distraught mother had not noticed. The wolf was not attacking. He was just standing there. The gray wolf slowly turned his head and met Thunder's gaze. Two old warriors, two patriarchs, each of whom knew the price of life and death. There was no hatred in their eyes. There was something else, a heavy, ancient understanding. This silent duel of glances lasted only a few seconds, but to Andre, it seemed like an eternity. Then Gray, showing neither fear nor aggression, turned smoothly. He did not run. He walked away slowly, with dignity. His limp seemed to worsen. He was almost dragging his hind leg. He dissolved into the wall of rain as quietly as he had appeared. Zarya rushed to Vetter, showering him with nudges and licking his wet fur. Grom stared after the wolf for a few more seconds, then turned to his herd. The family was reunited. Andre lowered the lantern. He was alone at the edge of the ravine, soaked to the skin and shivering, but not from the cold. He had just witnessed a miracle. But when he raised the lantern again to take one last look at the departing wolf, he noticed several drops of blood on the ground where Gray had been standing. The blood was not the filly's. With an incredible effort to save Vetter, the old wolf seemed to have finally damaged his wounded paw or suffered a new injury. The savior himself was on the verge of death, and now he was even more helpless than the one he had just saved. The rain stopped as suddenly as it had started. The storm moved further away behind the stone ridge, leaving behind a ringing silence, ozone-filled air, and a world washed clean. Andre reached his shelter at dawn, wringing out his wet clothes as he went. He acted on autopilot. He replaced the wet flash drive in his camera with a dry one, put the batteries on charge, and lit the gas burner to heat water for tea. But his thoughts were far away. They were there, on the edge of the ravine. He replayed the scene over and over in his head. An old wolf dying of hunger, a defenseless foal, and this impossible, inexplicable act, salvation. And then, drops of blood on the wet grass, the Savior's blood. Andre realized that his project, his photo story about wild horses, was dead. It no longer mattered, because the real story, the one that had turned his whole world upside down, had just begun. And its main character was not the mighty stallion Grom, but a lonely, wounded wolf. In the morning, he found the herd. The horses stood in a sun-drenched meadow, greedily tearing at the wet, juicy grass. The scene seemed pastoral, but the scars of yesterday's storm were everywhere. Thunder stood slightly apart, a deep bite mark darkening his black flank, a reminder of the battle. He was the undisputed king. Blizzard, his rival, stood at the very edge of the herd, banished but not broken. He was surrounded by several young horses, his small army of losers. But all of Andre's attention was focused on Zarya and Vetter. The foal was alive. He stood huddled against his mother, limping noticeably, trying not to step on his injured hind leg. But he was alive. Zarya licked him with such tenderness and concern that Andre's heart ached. The herd had survived. The family, having gone through division and chaos, had only grown stronger. They licked their wounds and continued to live. But what about the one who had given them this opportunity, who had paid for the foal's life with his last ounce of strength? This thought would not leave Andre alone. He returned to the ravine. The sun had almost dried the ground, but the traces of the night's drama were still clearly visible. Here were the deep hoof prints where the herd had been running. Here was the slippery, clayey slope. And there was the very spot where the wolf had stood. Andre crouched down. The drops of blood he had seen at night in the light of the lantern had already soaked into the ground, leaving only faint brown stains. He followed the trail. It was almost hopeless. Wolves are masters of camouflage, and after the rain, the ground had turned to mud. But Andre was an experienced tracker. He wasn't looking for paw prints, but for broken twigs, flattened grass, and barely visible drops of blood on broad fern leaves. The trail didn't lead deeper into the forest, but along it, to a rocky outcrop that the locals called Wolf's Tooth. The wolf was moving slowly. The distance between the tracks of its injured paw and the healthy ones was uneven. It was clearly losing strength. Andre opened his backpack. Instead of a spare lens, he took out a first aid kit, a flask of clean water, and a vacuum-sealed package of dried meat, his untouchable reserve. He didn't know what he was going to do. He just knew he had to go on. He found him 2 hours later. The trail led him to a shallow crevice at the foot of a cliff. The gray-haired man lay there, curled up in a tight, trembling ball. At first, Andre thought he was too late. The wolf wasn't moving. But then he saw his thin sides rise and fall slightly. He was alive. His front paw, the one that had always hurt, was twisted at an unnatural angle and badly swollen. Apparently, while pushing the foal, he had fallen on it with all his weight, and the old injury had turned into a fracture. Gray was doomed. In this condition, he couldn't even hunt. He wouldn't even be able to reach the water. It was a slow, painful death from hunger and pain. Andre slowly approached, trying not to make a sound. The wolf heard him. He raised his head with difficulty. His yellow eyes were clouded with pain, but deep down they still burned with a wild, indomitable fire. A low, vibrating growl escaped from his chest. It was not a threat. It was the moan of a proud creature unwilling to show weakness to his enemy. "Quiet, quiet, my friend. I won't hurt you," Andre said softly, although he knew perfectly well that the wolf did not understand human language. But animals understand intonation. He spoke gently, soothingly. He slowly dropped to his knees, keeping a safe distance of about 10 meters. He did not make any sudden movements. He unzipped his backpack, took out the package of meat, and opened it. A fragrant, spicy smell wafted through the air. The wolf's eyes focused for a moment. Its nostrils quivered greedily. It had not eaten for almost a week. Andre divided the meat into several pieces. He carefully placed one of them on the ground, halfway between himself and the wolf, trying not to make any sudden movements. "This is for you. You deserve it," he whispered. The gray-haired man looked at the meat, then at the man. Two of his strongest instincts were fighting in his mind: primitive hunger and an innate fear of humans. It seemed like an eternity. The wolf did not move. Andre sat motionless, afraid to scare him away. He was already beginning to think that nothing would work, that the beast's pride would prove stronger than hunger. But then the gray wolf made his first move. Slowly, with visible effort, he pulled his healthy paws under himself. Every centimeter was painful for him. He crawled. He did not walk, but crawled along the ground, dragging his broken paw behind him, leaving a brown trail on the stones. His gaze was fixed on the piece of meat. It was a pitiful and at the same time majestic sight. The old leader, humiliated by pain and hunger, crawled for alms from his worst enemy. Finally, he reached it. He sank his teeth into the meat and swallowed it almost without chewing. He raised his head and looked at Andre. There was no fear in his eyes anymore, only expectation. Andre threw him a second piece, this time a little closer to himself. The gray-haired wolf, without hesitation, crawled after the second piece, and then the third. He ate everything. The last piece lay just a couple of meters from Andre's boots. Having eaten his fill, the wolf seemed to come to his senses a little. The trembling in his body subsided. He lay there, breathing heavily, and looked at the man. Andre felt that some kind of invisible thread had formed between them, a fragile semblance of trust. He decided to take a chance. He slowly, very slowly, reached out his hand toward the wolf, not to pet him, just as a gesture of goodwill. And that was a mistake. The moment his hand crossed the invisible boundary of the beast's personal space, instinct took over. The wolf's brain, a split second ahead of his mind, reacted to the movement as a threat. With a hollow roar mixed with pain and rage, Gray made a lightning-fast lunge. He didn't try to grab it seriously. It was a desperate warning throw. The click of his teeth rang out a centimeter from Andre's fingers. Immediately after that, the wolf yelped from the pain in its broken paw and collapsed to the ground, exhausted. Andre pulled his hand back, his heart pounding wildly. He froze, staring into the beast's eyes full of suffering and rage, and realized that he had just made a fatal mistake. He had crossed the line. Now the wild beast saw him not as a savior, but as a direct threat. And the next attack, even with its last ounce of strength, could be his last. The silence that hung between the man and the wolf was thick and heavy, like a stone. Andre froze, not daring to move. His hand, which he had so carelessly reached out, froze in the air. He looked into the gray wolf's yellow eyes and saw a storm raging there. Pain, fear, despair, and the remnants of wild, irreconcilable rage. The wolf was breathing heavily, his chest heaving in ragged gasps. He was at his limit. Andre realized that one wrong move, one sharp breath, and the beast, even dying, would lunge again. He had broken the main rule of dealing with wild animals: never make them feel cornered. Slowly, inch by inch, he began to pull his hand back, returning it to a neutral position. He did not look away, showing that he was not afraid, but also not challenging the wolf. "I'm sorry. It was my fault. It was stupid," he said quietly. The words were for himself, to calm his wildly beating heart. The gray-haired man seemed to understand his intention. He did not lower his head, but the growling in his chest subsided. Andre, still moving slowly, began to back away, increasing the distance between them. He moved back to his original position 10 meters away and sat down on the ground again. There was a pause. The tension gradually eased. The wolf no longer saw him as an immediate threat. Now it just watched. Andre decided to change tactics. He took a water flask and a metal bowl out of his backpack. He poured water into it and, as carefully as he had thrown the meat before, pushed it across the smooth stones toward the wolf. The bowl clattered a few meters and stopped. This time, Gray didn't hesitate. Thirst tormented him no less than hunger. He crawled forward again, pushing with his healthy paws, and greedily lapped up the water. The clatter of his teeth against the metal echoed in the silence of the crevice. He drank every last drop and looked at Andre. There was no aggression in his gaze anymore, only a question. Andre realized that the first, most dangerous stage had been passed. He had not become a friend, but he was no longer an enemy. He had become something incomprehensible, a source of food and water that, for some reason, demanded nothing in return. This shattered all the wolf's ideas about the world. Andre decided to stay. He understood that if he left now, Gray would simply die a slow death. He set up his mini-camp right there, at the entrance to the crevice. He took out his sleeping bag, a burner, and the remains of his provisions. He turned his photo hunt into a rescue operation without the slightest idea of what he would do next. The next 3 days turned into a strange, silent ritual. In the morning, Andre would go to the stream for fresh water, leaving a portion of dried meat for the wolf. Sedoy would watch him go, but did not try to leave. He was too weak. When Andre returned, he would sit down in his place and just watch. They spent hours in silent companionship. André read a book, cleaned his lenses, and made notes in his diary. The gray wolf lay in his hollow, and his wounded paw seemed to be getting worse. The swelling had increased. André, who had basic veterinary knowledge, understood that without help, the wound would become infected. But how could he help an animal that wouldn't let him come closer than 5 meters? Meanwhile, changes were taking place in the herd. The wind was quickly improving. The limp was becoming less noticeable. The horror he had experienced made him more cautious, and he no longer strayed more than a step away from Zari. But the main change took place in the hierarchy. Thunder, having healed his wounds, finally established his authority. But his victory came at a price. Burin and his small group broke away from the main herd. They kept their distance of several hundred meters, grazed on the same meadows, drank from the same stream, but were no longer part of the family. The herd was divided. This made both groups more vulnerable. André saw this when he briefly left his post at the crevice to watch the horses from a distance. He saw how Grom was now forced to divide himself, controlling not only his own group, but also keeping an eye on the actions of the renegades. He saw how Burin, trying to prove his worth, was taking risky actions, leading his followers too far away, to the most dangerous slopes overgrown with windfall. André understood that a new tragedy was only a matter of time. On the 4th day, André made up his mind. He could no longer watch Sedoy's suffering. He crushed several tablets of a strong antibiotic and painkiller from his first aid kit into powder and mixed them into a piece of meat. It was a huge risk. The wolf could smell the foreign scent and refused to eat. But there was no choice. He placed the medicine in its usual place. Sedoy, as usual, crawled toward the food. He sniffed the piece longer than usual. André's heart stopped. But hunger won again. The wolf swallowed the meat. Now all that was left to do was wait. By evening, the effect was noticeable. For the first time in many days, Gray slept peacefully, without shuddering from pain. His breathing became more even. The painkiller was working. This small victory gave André courage. He decided he had to examine the paw. At night, when the wolf was fast asleep under the influence of the medicine, André, armed with a flashlight, decided to take the most dangerous step. He approached closely. Gray was asleep, but his ears twitched slightly. André held his breath. He knelt down next to the huge predator. The smell of the wild animal hit his nose. Carefully, trying not to touch the fur, he shone the light on the wounded paw. The picture was worse than he had thought. It was an open fracture. A sharp piece of bone had pierced the skin. The wound had already begun to fester. Without surgical intervention, the wolf didn't stand a chance. André realized that his help wasn't enough. He needed a veterinarian, but where could he find one in the middle of the wilderness? Then he remembered. About 30 kilometers from here, down the river, was the hut of an old gamekeeper named Michalic. André had met him when he first arrived in the area. Michalic was a man of the old school, taciturn and stern. But he knew the forest like the back of his hand. And, most importantly, he had a satellite phone and an old UAZ. André had also heard that Michalic had once worked as a veterinarian on a state farm. It was his only, slim chance. He made up his mind. Early in the morning, he would leave the wolf a double portion of food and water with the medicine and set off for the gamekeeper. It was a risky plan. The journey there and back would take a whole day. Sedoy would be left alone. Anything could happen to him. But there was no other way out. At dawn, he packed a light backpack, left everything Sedoy needed, and was ready to go. But casting a farewell glance at the crevice, he froze. The wolf was not lying down. He was standing. He was leaning on 3 paws, holding his injured leg up. He was not looking at Andre. He was looking at the valley. And he growled. Quietly, hollowly, almost silently. But his whole body was tense, like a taut string. Andre followed his gaze, and he saw. Borana's herd was grazing on the dangerous slope at the very edge of the canyon. And on the opposite edge, on a rocky ledge, Andre saw several more shadows. 4, 5. It wasn't just one shadow like before. It was a pack, a new young pack of wolves that had come to this territory. And they weren't just watching. They began to surround the horses, cutting off their retreat. Burin, in his arrogance, had led his little herd right into a trap. The gray-haired, old, exiled leader saw this, and he, chained to the spot by his mortal wound, tried to warn them. But his roar was too weak. No one but Andre heard him, and the photographer realized that his trip to the gamekeeper would have to wait. Right now, before his very eyes, a new, even bloodier drama was about to unfold. Time froze, then exploded into action. The wolves did not attack like a lone, desperate predator. They were a well-oiled killing machine. 2 cut off the retreat, and 3, as if on cue, rushed at the herd from different sides. Their goal was not to fight, but to cause panic. They sought to break the formation and separate the weakest victim. Burin reacted with desperate bravery. He darted between his horses, rearing up and striking out with his hooves. But he was alone against 5. His followers, inexperienced and young, huddled together in a trembling heap, completely losing the will to resist. Andre realized he had to do something. Forgetting about secrecy, he jumped to his feet. "Hey, go away," he shouted, his voice sounding pitiful and weak. The wolves did not even turn their heads. Then he grabbed the first thing that came to hand, the lid of his helmet and a stone. He began to bang on it, creating a deafening, chaotic din. This sound, alien to the wild, caused the wolves to slow down for a second. One of them, the leader of the new pack, large and dark, turned and looked at Andre with cold contempt. He assessed the threat and saw none. The man was too far away. The attack resumed. One of the wolves managed to break through and sank its teeth into the side of a young mare. She whinnied in pain and terror. Borana's herd was doomed. Andre watched the unfolding carnage in despair. He was powerless. And just at that moment, when all hope seemed lost, a sound tore through the air, sending a chill down Andre's spine. It was a howl, but not the howl of a hungry pack. It was a low, guttural, incredibly powerful roar, full of undeniable power. It was the howl of an old leader claiming his territory. Andre turned around. The gray-haired wolf stood at the entrance to the crevice on 3 legs. His entire body trembled with superhuman tension. He put all his remaining life, all his pain, all his fury into that howl. And the young wolves heard him. They froze as if on command. Their attack was interrupted. They began to look around, their ears twitching nervously. They couldn't see the source of the sound, but they recognized it. It was the voice of the Alpha, the voice of the law. Their coordination was broken. They were confused. The master of their territory, which they considered their own, had appeared. And that brief pause was enough. From the neighboring hill, Grom's herd descended like an avalanche. The mighty leader, hearing the noise of battle and the howls of his old rival, did not hesitate for a second. He was not saving Burin. He was defending his land from intruders. His herd, united and experienced, crashed into the confused pack of wolves. This was no longer a hunt, but a battle. Faced with the organized force of dozens of angry horses, the wolves did not take up the fight. They were hunters, not warriors. Tucking their tails between their legs, they scattered and disappeared into the forest as quickly as they had appeared. Silence reigned in the clearing, broken only by the heavy breathing of the horses and the moans of the wounded mare. The two herds stood facing each other. Grom and Burin met each other's gaze. There was no more arrogance in the young stallion's eyes, only shame and silent gratitude. He slowly bowed his head, a sign of complete and unconditional submission. Grom accepted his surrender. He turned and led his herd to the stream, and Burin, with his surviving followers, slowly followed him. The family was reunited, not out of love, but out of the law of survival. Andrei, shaken, looked at the crevice. He rushed to run, jumping over rocks and bushes. "Gray-haired, I'm here. I saw it. You did it," he shouted as he ran. He ran up to the crevice, his heart ready to jump out of his chest. Gray lay on the ground. He was no longer trembling. His eyes were half open and staring at the valley, but they could no longer see anything. His last howl had taken his last breath. The old wolf was dead. Andrei knelt down beside him. Carefully, no longer afraid, he reached out and touched the stiff, matted fur on his neck. The animal was still warm. Andrei sat there for a long time until the sun began to set. He did not go for help from the gamekeeper. Instead, he took his entrenching shovel and began to dig. He buried the old wolf there at the foot of the cliff, overlooking the valley he had defended until his last breath. He built a small mound of stones over the grave. It was the only monument he could give him. A week later, Andrei Sokolov left. His backpacks were full of footage. But he knew that the most important shots would remain only in his memory. Back in the city, he sat down at his desk and laid out the printed photos. Here was the mighty thunder, symbol of power. Here was the naive wind, playing with a butterfly. Here was the frightened dawn. And here was one of the last photos of Gray. He was looking at the herd from the hill, and there was no hunger in his eyes, only endless, ancient wisdom. Andrei realized that he had come here to film a story about the struggle for life. But in the end, he had witnessed a story about its value. He didn't know why the old wolf saved the foal and then warned the herd of danger at the cost of his own life. But he knew one thing. It was the most honest and incredible story he had ever seen. And now it was his duty to tell it to the world. What do you think of Gray's actions in the finale? Was it an instinct to protect his territory from foreign wolves, or a conscious act of helping the horses?